Good afternoon from New York at the Hiraman Institute, Columbia University. It's evening in Europe. We welcome all of our viewers. Today's seminar is to reflect on the Dayton Peace Accords, the 25th anniversary, which is it's very close in terms of time of the anniversary. A reminder to our audience, we will accept questions through the chat on Zoom and through the chat mechanism on live stream. Without further ado, what I want to say is, before we introduce our panelists, is that while we know that Dayton stopped a terrible, terrible war, and if the United States had not leveraged its diplomatic and military power to stop that war, many more would have died. More than 110,000 died as it was, more than 2.5 million refugees. It was, like many peace agreements, it was an imperfect instrument. Even the late Richard Holbrooke, the US diplomat who led those negotiations at Dayton, admitted they were never intended to be a static document. Today, our panelists are going to discuss its legacy and offer ideas and insights about what's worked and what should be reformed. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Robert Gelbard, a former colleague of mine. I worked with him during the Dayton implementation period. He is an international business consultant, and his 35-year of foreign service career included numerous senior policy positions, including ambassador to Indonesia and East Timor, ambassador to Bolivia. He was also on point for this discussion today, President Clinton's special representative to the Balkans. He's also a member of the ORID group, working on North Macedonia. I'm delighted to have him join us today. And he is a very distinguished diplomat who continues to be very engaged in Europe, including in North Macedonia most recently, and is a very worthy discussant of today's seminar. Secondly, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Ralph Bajrović, who has served as the president of the Emerging Democracies Institute in Washington, D.C., is president of the Civic Alliance in Sarajevo. Ralph Bajrović served as Minister of Energy, Industry, and Mining of the Federation government in Bosnia. He has had a broad background as a consultant working with a number of foundations and international development agencies. Most recently, he's been published by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm delighted that he has joined us today. Also joining us just now, Vildana, if you could open up your video so we can see you. I see that you're here, you've joined us. Vildana Silimbegović is joining us. She's the editor-in-chief of Oslobođenje, the oldest daily newspaper in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was established in 1943 as an anti-fascist newspaper during World War II. It has a celebrated history. Most noteworthy was the efforts of its staff during the 92 to 95 war, when the newsroom was essentially destroyed. They worked from a bomb shelter, publishing almost every day with the exception of one day during that war. They are lauded, admired, and well-deserved. And our last guest is a colleague and friend, Dr. Kurt Basinger, who's the co-founder of the Democratization Policy Council, which is based in Berlin, has been very active on analyzing issues in the Balkans. He is now an official doctor. He recently defended his doctoral dissertation on peace cartels, internationally brokered power sharing, and perpetual oligarchy in Bosnia and Herzegovina and North Macedonia at St. Andrews. He actually lived in Sarajevo from 2005 to 2016, a true Bosnian supporter. So now I would like to turn this over to Ambassador Gelbard. Our panelists are going to make opening comments, and we will then engage in a conversation, and we will accept questions from our viewers. Ambassador Gelbard.
Well, first, my thanks to the Harriman Institute and Columbia University, and most especially to you, Tanya, for inviting me to this important discussion. I had the great privilege of becoming involved with the implementation of the Dayton Agreement just 2 weeks after it was signed, when Richard Holbrooke asked me to go to Sarajevo and to begin working on this. And then I returned to the region 1 month later, had my first meeting with Milosevic, returned to Sarajevo, and then shortly thereafter, the White House asked me to design the strategy and plan to capture the war criminals, which I did, and then established a multilateral group to begin to do that. And then, of course, I succeeded Richard Holbrooke, if that's possible, but began to work running US Balkans policy, which I continued to do through the end of the Kosovo War. I've maintained a strong interest in the region and in Bosnia-Herzegovina particularly, and unfortunately haven't been able to visit for the last year for obvious reasons. As you said at the beginning, this was an agreement to stop the war and to stop killing. And in that sense, it succeeded. But it was indeed flawed from the beginning, as we knew at the very time it was signed. Whether it was, regardless of which annex it was, we knew that there were serious flaws. The issue now is, 25 years later, how to take the Dayton Agreement, move it to something else so that Bosnia-Herzegovina will become a successful, sustainable state. Failure to do that will mean that Bosnia-Herzegovina will fail. It is stagnating now, and it will continue to stagnate without some dramatic change. Clearly, there has been a lack of leadership on the part of the leaders in the country itself, but there has also been a serious lack of leadership on the part of the EU and the United States. I recognize very strongly that when the Bush administration came in, they didn't want to have anything to do with the country because that was the Clinton issue. They focused on Kosovo. When the Obama administration came in, tepid interest in the region. Still in Kosovo and a few other places, but not much. And of course, over the last 4 years, heaven help us. But there's an opportunity now. And I have to say, the European Union, I feel, backed away almost completely from its responsibility in this area too. There has been some involvement in the Serbia-Kosovo area, particularly with Cathy Ashton, but not in Bosnia. And I think several steps need to be taken right now. One very important one, and I have to go back, excuse me for saying this to my European friends, but I keep going back to 1991 and Jacques Post saying this is the hour of Europe. So we continue to wait for the Europeans to do what they say they're going to do. On Monday, Angela Merkel spoke with Joe Biden and said Europe is prepared to take on much more responsibility without being specific about where or to what degree and how. This is the area, I think, where Europe has the obligation and the ability to take on much more responsibility along with strong American help. There has been talk, of course, about another Dayton Agreement or another conference of that sort, and perhaps that's needed. One thing I would say that really is needed is to find ways to begin to make Republika Srpska a more cooperative and viable entity. I was appalled that the EU backed away so strongly from the use of the bond powers. I think the High Representative needs to be fortified. I think that individual, whoever it is who takes that job, needs to be able to have a strong range of authorities at his or her disposition in order to be able to enforce laws and requirements that are currently being ignored. In 1999, Carlos Westendorp, when he was High Representative, removed the president of Republika Srpska, Nikola Poplošin, with my encouragement, I have to say, and at my urging. Things like this need to be done again. Dodik can't seem to decide whether he wants an independent country, whether he wants to be part of Serbia, or whether he wants to continue to stay as part of Bosnia-Herzegovina to try to hamstring it, to prevent it from becoming a viable country. But the key point is it needs to be a viable country. It doesn't mean a unitary state. The United States is a federal system, and there are many other countries which are federal systems. But there need to be functioning national institutions which make the country function. The central bank is one which has functioned, and I'm an economist by background, and I was deeply involved, in fact, in establishing agreement on setting up the central bank and the currency board. But there need to be state institutions which are functioning, and that needs to be done with strong support, political will, to use that term, and effort on the part of the EU, the United States, and yes, Russia, and several others to make any of this work. Last thing I'll say is, I think the neighbors need to cooperate too. One of the really important questions that has come, that I think about all the time, is how Croatia has been able to join the EU. I consider Croatia to be uncooperative regarding Bosnia-Herzegovina. I believe it continues to have territorial ambitions about part of the country. And the European Union and its members need to use their authority and their political will to have Croatia cooperate in every possible way. And as for Serbia, I know President Vučić very well. I admire him in certain ways. He has played a very interesting game regarding Republika Srpska. At times, he helps to keep Dodik in check. At times, he plays games talking about Greater Serbia again. Between the United States and the European Union, there needs to be a cooperative effort to make sure that Serbia understands that it needs to cooperate in every possible way to make Bosnia-Herzegovina a viable, serious state. Otherwise, there need to be consequences, just as there need to be for Croatia. But I think the point is, time is wasting. We see young people leaving Bosnia-Herzegovina, as we do in other countries in the Western Balkans. We are at an interesting political point with the Biden administration about to come into power. There will be greater interest in the Western Balkans. I know that Boris Johnson and Biden discussed the region when they talked this week. We need to take advantage of that moment, working with the EU, working with people like Merkel and others to develop an impetus to get this moving and to make dramatic change so that Bosnia-Herzegovina will become sustainable and viable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gelbard. Over to you, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Tanya. I hope Vildana feels better. I'm very sad that she cannot join us. Almir Shechkanovic, her deputy, and I think is now the editor-in-chief of their O channel, has joined us. And I'll start off by saying that I agree with everything that Ambassador Gelbart said, which is extremely rare for me, especially for those of you who know me well, know that that's probably never the case. The only other person I'll probably completely agree with on this issue is Kurt, which means that I'm going to take many of his talking points, except for one. And I'll start with the one that I know that we disagree on, and I think is absolutely crucial for American audiences to understand. America is going to be coming back, in my view, to the Balkans with the Biden administration. I think that's as certain as Biden's victory. I think that people in the Biden team are very interested in the Balkans because Biden himself has, as most of our audience knows, been very, very active during the war, and he feels very strongly about the Balkans personally, especially about Bosnia. Unlike some other American Balkan hands, Biden was always more interested in Bosnia than in Kosovo, which doesn't mean that Kosovo does not need attention. But in this specific case, I think that Ambassador Gelbart said something that most people in the Balkans don't understand, which is that the Bush administration was not really interested in Bosnia. It's absolutely true. They managed to end U.S. troop presence here very, very quickly and did it without any really considerations for the consequences. However, the key disagreement I have with the majority of people who analyze this region, feel strongly about this region, who like this region, who are from the West, and especially people who are Americans, who I think see the region much differently than, and I'm American myself, but I think Americans do not have the necessary experience in terms of, Americans simply don't want to see the way that Europe sees this region, which is as a Muslim part of Europe. I mean, that's the elephant in the room that I think we have to address. And there's, in my view, after all these years, after having spent so many years doing this myself, over 2 decades, I cannot explain any other way the fact that Serbia is considered the front runner of EU integration process, that Montenegro is right below Serbia, that Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania have joined the EU, and that Kosovo, Bosnia, Albania, and Turkey are the sort of the last ones in this this line of entry. That there's simply too much discrepancy in the EU approach to the region for this to, in my view, maybe this is not the main reason, but this is something we have to address. This is the elephant in the room. The question that EU has to ask itself: does the EU want a Muslim majority country in its midst? I think Macron doesn't. I think majority of EU countries do not. But the question of all, the mother of all questions is, what does Germany want with the new Biden administration? Does Germany want to change this perception that's now very deeply entrenched among people who make decisions in the region? They don't want to talk about it as freely as I do, because I'm able to talk about it without consequences. But EU has to prove what I'm saying wrong. We have to see one of the Muslim majority countries join the EU within the next 10 to 12 years. Otherwise, I fear that we're going to be heading towards a sort of a Huntingtonian, it's not going to be a clash, but there will certainly, people will start realizing that we are a different civilization as compared to the Western Europeans who've now decided to integrate some parts of Eastern Europe into it. I think the Russians feel the same way. I think Ukrainians will probably start feeling the same way unless they're given a chance to do something to create some sort of a perception of closer links with Europe. And I think Biden administration is the absolute last chance to do something about this in the whole region. I think that Biden administration is aware of this. And I think the most important thing that we all need to keep in mind is that local actors have agency, but the reality we're in right now is entirely, overwhelmingly a result of the incentives that the EU has decided to put into the political realities of the region. So the reason Croatia has joined the EU is because the EU decided it wanted Croatia in. And they played the criteria game, which is highly political. There's nothing objective about the criteria that they set forth for entry. They have decided to take Croatia in, and then there was a 9. There was as soon as Merkel came to power in Germany, after all these years, now maybe Kurt disagrees with this, maybe agrees, but I think that Merkel really deep down inside decided she does not want to enlarge the EU any further, and this has been the go-to EU. This is the play that they have. They want to keep the region where it is. Promoting Serbia to front-runner status meant that the rest of the countries would basically be stagnating, because if Serbia is supposed to join first, it's going to take a long time before Serbia joins, for a number of reasons. Serbia is simply, as a society right now, on the verge of autocracy. And this is a direct result of what the EU did. But most importantly, I think in Bosnia, and this is the biggest lesson learned for the Dayton revision project, which I think is about to take place in some shape or form. Local actors will respond to incentives. If the EU decides to go along with what Biden hopefully wants, and I think the Brits will join the Biden plan, and hopefully we get the Germans on our side as well. It has to involve what the Ambassador Gelbart said. OHR has to be strengthened, rules of the game must be reimposed, and there must be some sort of increase of military presence somewhere on the ground. I've been for many years arguing for increase of military presence in Brčko, which I'm sure that Kurt is going to repeat as well, because he has been doing the same thing exactly. And then once we have reestablished the rules and deterrence, we can talk about changes that need to take place. And my last point is that the changes that we can all agree on will take place if the incentives within Bosnia change. And the reason that Dodik has been so willing to chip away at the state level, essentially, he's been lessening the potency, the strength of the state level institutions for the last 14, 15 years. It will be 15 years actually come January. With the full awareness of the EU. EU knew exactly what he was doing. EU refused to introduce sanctions. EU, for at least a decade, tried to close down OHR, despite knowing the fact that if OHR is closed, Bosnia will essentially be the only system in the world without a final arbiter. There'll be no adjudicator. Bosnia does not have a Supreme Court. There's nothing in the system that would prevent Dodik from claiming whatever he wants to claim. So I think that was Dodik's plan all along. He did not count on international on Biden's victory. Let's just be very honest. So I think that for any type of change to happen, rules must be reinstated. And for rules to be reinstated, the Germans must change their view on OHR and the usage of bomb powers. Because Germany has for the last 10 years very openly sided with the Russians at the Peace Implementation Council SBA meetings. They prevented Dodik from being sanctioned in 2016, 2017, 2018. Even after US introduced sanctions, Merkel's response was that EU doesn't do sanctions, which after Lukashenko, now we know to be false. EU does do sanctions if EU wants to do sanctions. There was simply no political will to do that. And if there's an effort to change things on the ground, basically change Bosnia's constitution, without rules of the game being reimposed, it will fail. If Dodik and Čović see a way out, they will go through that door. So the engagement must be firm, very clear, and it must involve consequences. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Well, what's interesting is that not only do I agree with Ambassador Gelbart, but I agree with Ralph Bajrović. And I think one of the big omissions that we've really felt in Bosnia is the lack of leadership by the UK, by the Brexit vote. And really, the US just has not been muscularly engaged. And if it's left to the EU without a really strong, muscular US relationship, things really did stagnate. That's what we've all seen and what we've all been frustrated with. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kurt Basinger.
Thank you, Tanya. And I largely agree with what both Bob and Rayo have said. and there's no denying, because Rayof raised the point that he thought I would disagree with him. There's no denying there's an undercurrent of what Rayof thinks is the problem within the European Union. I think it's even more. I think it's even a lower problem, which is not to say that's not part of it. I think the biggest problem we're facing in policy toward Bosnia-Herzegovina and the whole Western Balkans is the philosophical underpinnings have been proven wrong, and nobody wants to admit that it was wrong. The idea that if you have the open door to the EU and NATO, the political elites are going to straighten up and fly right and do what they say they're going to do and meet these conditions, I think has been proven wrong. I think it's been demonstrated to be false. Bosnia is the worst case in a lot of ways because there's a structural confluence there, but the incentive structure regionally has been miscalibrated. The United States has taken a backseat to the European Union there. It needs to be a partnership. Certainly, there's a very strong argument for the European Union taking a leadership role. But if in the very European Union source code, the idea is partnership with elites, it began with as an elite project, we're going to partner with elites and we're going to presume they're democratic. So in the first wave of European Union enlargement, Central Eastern European Union, Europe, it was known to be an experiment. It got codified, and then there was this mentality that the European Union thought it could just plug and play. And I think that's been proven false, but nobody wants to admit it. And the biggest tragedy in the past year, it might not be seen as a tragedy, is that when it finally rose to the apex of the political level, out of the bureaucratic swamp that the policy had been stuck in, with Macron applying the brakes to North Macedonia and Albania, and finally had an opportunity to recalibrate the entire approach to the region, to be much more citizen-centric, they didn't do it. Then the countries that did want to push enlargement, and Germany was chief among them, said, let's get around this. Let's drive around this roadblock, and we'll worry about the whole policy later. And that, I think, is a mistake. But I don't want to burn up too much of my airtime on that. But I think Rayof's absolutely right that the incentive structure is the problem. For the first 10 years after Dayton, particularly after the bond powers were started to be implemented, and especially in the state building period of, say, 2000 to 2005, and I checked in right at the tail end of this, and that sort of masked the Bush administration's disengagement because they effectively gave carte blanche to Patty Ashdown, and before that to Wolfgang Petrych. Those two were the two strongest state building high reps in terms of getting things done, getting institutions, mostly through intergovernmental agreement between the entities, but it would not have happened had that overarching structure of enforcement tools, both the high rep and S4 then becoming U4 at the end of 2004. Without those enforcement tools, which are still legally just as valid as they always were, but they've been allowed to rust. So we enforce the rules. Now there are no rules effectively. They're there, but these guys, there are no consequences for malfeasance. You've seen the corruption explode in the public consciousness. The one benefit that I think we have, and I'll be interested to hear what the Bosnians think about this in our discussion. I would say Bosnia at the popular level is less divided than the United States is right now, but it's masked by the structure. I think there's a lot more possibility at the popular level. If you had a referendum tomorrow asking if people wanted to send all their political elites to go to Leotok, yours, mine, theirs, it would be yes. And that would be a positive. I'd be happy to do a lawnmower, but then you have to come up with something better. And so it's not just a question of tweaking Dayton and adjusting Dayton. It's a question of developing a new social contract that is based on popular legitimacy. And that will take time, but the biggest value added that a Biden administration can give, and I'm very glad to hear that this was discussed with Prime Minister Johnson. And I'm certainly hoping Merkel is the other essential piece in this puzzle, because that's the center of gravity of the European Union. Those are the parts that need to be aligned for a strategic rethink of the policy. And the first element of that, before you even start going toward what comes next, is to reassert rules. close the exits, change the dynamic that the political elites have. So very briefly on what I had done with my dissertation, because it's relevant here, just this is the way it works now. The political elite, yes, they're divided. They have disagreements among them that are very important, but they can all agree on three things. They want to keep what they stole, they want to remain empowered to keep stealing, and they want to remain unaccountable, both legally and politically. The Dayton system offers them something, and under current incentive structures, as an amplifier, offers them a better deal than anything the EU can offer them. That's why there's no forward movement. They're able to apply leverage of fear, and fear is free. And we have allowed them to amplify that fear by not enforcing the rules. But there's also patronage, and that's not just our money. That's money they take from their citizens, or effectively take from their citizens in advance by incurring debt. But there's also fear that goes up toward us. That's why I call this a peace cartel, because the implicit threat is we can make sure there's no peace unless you give us what we want. And so the patronage comes down from us in terms of IFI loans, so forth. So I'll stop sharing that right now. But the structure that needs to change is the pressure needs to come from both sides. That's how we got forward movement in North Macedonia. Before we started, I was talking to Ambassador Gelbard, who's been involved there. That's effectively what you had starting with Pershing after Kumanovo in 2015. That finally brought us off the fence. After civic movement started happening at the end of 2014, the opposition caught on. So I think reasserting those rules, and then saying, look, we can't dictate to you what your new constitutional order should be, but these are the things you're going to have to do to be able to join our clubs, including NATO, because there's no way Bosnia is getting into NATO under this constitution with effective RS veto. This is not happening. There are a lot of ways that we can assert security in the interim and then get to a constitutional order where that's feasible. Because I know that one of the main drivers on that is the security concern that people legitimately have in Bosnia because they don't feel that they're covered, and EUFOR is anemic. But I think that the most important thing that the Biden administration can do is demonstrate quite clearly that the entire thought process that we've been gliding on since 2006 is going to be reassessed. And we're going to do it. We're going to do it together with our European partners, but it is going to be more muscular, and there are going to be rules. A comment on removing people. Now, I certainly believe the High Rep needs those powers. I think it's much more effective to just take the talking points away. If you take away the ability to leverage fear, particularly from Milorad Dodik, and he's the squeakiest wheel, but a lot of people ride behind him. He was the squeakiest wheel on making sure that unaccountability was locked in by getting rid of international judges and prosecutors. But nobody else really went to bat for that, because they're all organized criminals too. He's just the loudest one with the best position structurally, and that's also his style. And we've accommodated them. The perversity of this is these guys are not, uniquely evil people, but they're uniquely empowered right now. And they've been able to not only dictate the life chances of their citizens through their full spectrum dominance, but we've allowed them to dictate our policy to us, because our expectations have been so low that all we want is for it not to be a problem. That's the bar. And that, I think, coming back to where I started with Rayo, I think that's the low bar that the European Union has had. And it's not just to Bosnia. I would say it's to the whole region, but Bosnia is at the back of that queue. And so I'll end there because I'd like to leave more time for discussion, but thank you very much for the opportunity and invitation. I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Kurt. And now I'm going to introduce Almir Sakanovic. He's stepping in for Vildana Salim Begovic. Almir is currently the head of O Kanal, which is the Slobodina's media TV group. And he previously worked at Al Jazeera Balkans for 8 years. It's a great media outlet as well. Almir, your role as a journalist is really important, and I wanted a journalist on this panel because you are the eyes and ears, and you talk to people, and we want to hear your thoughts about where we are with Dayton and what you see in reporting that gives you concerns or ideas as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on this panel. And when you speak, I make few notes, so I will read it. For the people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Dayton is the most famous place in United States. That is place where we got peace, but peace which is quite a long way from happiness and normality. What went wrong? We ask every day. When we made mistakes, not only we in Bosnia, but also international community. What's happened in these 25 years? I believe that international community made few mistakes when we speak about implementation of Dayton Peace Agreement. For these 25 years, international community didn't find any valid way to punish war criminals, especially in the first years after the war. I don't need to remember you that we still wait for final sentence for Ratko Mladic, and it's 25 years from Dayton. So people think about that. So I believe the media are investigation story about that. So that is some topic in this 25 years. Also, in some moment, politicians from Bosnia realized that EU and United States lost their interest for Balkans and Bosnia. After that, they start with national games and rising of ethnic tensions. As a result, we have Milorad Dodik in his best edition, in an edition that is okay only to the Serbian nationalists and some representative of Russia in this part of Europe. I don't remember the day when peace agreement was signed. I was 11. But I don't know anything in my country which is not in some connection with Dayton Peace Agreement. From health sector, which is on canton and municipality level, not on the state level because of Dayton. Education, which is separate because of Dayton Agreement, election law, media, and so on. So we live Dayton 25 years. I believe that's something that I should mention in this statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to take questions from the viewers. Ambassador Gelbart, do you think within the Biden, and Ralph also is familiar, within the Biden foreign policy team, the Western Balkans, obviously, for all of us, we're of course very concerned, but there's been really a lack of leadership, and I agree with everything you said. Do you think this is going to be a priority? I mean, Bosnia is in existential, it's lived existentially with threat for a long time. And you mentioned migration. Well, we're seeing just vast numbers of young people have left. There's over 500,000 people from the former Yugoslav Western Balkan states living in Vienna, and you're losing healthcare workers. People are leaving, and I actually consider that a national security issue in the short term and the long term. If you don't have people who can be engaged in the economy, you're not going to be able to have any kind of economic well-being, and then it leads and yields to political instability as well, which has continued for Bosnia. And I think from a morals perspective, not that national interests have anything to do with morality, but in this case, it was our agreement. And, we should get back to finishing and helping them be able to live a sustained, peaceful, in a democratic country. I'd like to hear your thoughts about how you see the priorities from Biden.
I have several things to say on this. First, it's easy to make this a higher priority, especially considering that nobody else is really no other administration has really focused on this very much since the Clinton administration. The question is how high a priority. One of the problems that an incoming Biden administration faces is that the wreckage of the Trump administration's foreign policy is global. And the challenges that the Biden administration faces on foreign policy are global. That's why, as we have all said, there needs to be a strong partnership between the United States and the EU to make this work. But one of the fundamental questions is whether the EU does have the political will, to be serious about engaging on Bosnia-Herzegovina. Whether Angela Merkel is serious about playing a constructive and important role on this, whether Macron is, whether the UK is, I realize they will be part of the EU, and the other countries, the illiberal ones too. So those are all really important questions, but there's no question in my mind that this is going to become an important issue. Second thing I want to say, and I should have really emphasized this in my first remarks, I think we're all being a little passive aggressive here about putting everything on the international community. I've worked in with a lot of countries going through democratic transition, recovering from wars, whether in Latin America or in Southeast Asia or in Europe. We can help create what I call a framework of possibility. And ultimately, it is up in part to the international community to help with this. But that framework of possibility, after a certain amount of time, has to be taken up by the population of the country involved. And one of the things we really haven't talked about enough, although there's been some discussion of this by Kurt and particularly, has been that there has been a lack of movement, a lack of political will on the part of the people and elites in Bosnia-Herzegovina to really do what is required to make their own country function. To make democratic institutions function, there has to be political will. And that's something that we really need to see much more of. And by the way, I do consider the media to be a democratic institution, and the media have to play a very important role in making these institutions function too.
Thank you. Ralph, I just want to go back to your comments about the EU and how they see a country that is majority Muslim. And we can see, I just want to mention that when the EU delayed enlargement to North Macedonia and Albania, it was Macron, yielding the veto, coming out first, and he was backed by the Dutch, among others. And this is something I think your observations about Americans is correct, that a lot of Americans don't really understand how the EU views a Muslim-dominated country, but also just the Balkans in general. And there's really a hierarchy, I think, that's very, very much built into the culture of Europe, of how they really look down on the Balkans. And in many cases, I do call it racism. And there's a part of it, it's really, really racist. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Turn on your mic, Rave.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think the best comparison is the paradigm we have in the US that was thoroughly dismantled. It was delegitimized. The way that the racist structures in the US really portrayed the African American population. The difference here is that the people who are viewed as sort of, of lesser value have their own countries. That's the difference. So what I think the key moment for me was 2013, when EU-led talks to implement the so-called Sejdić-Finci decision of the European Court on Human Rights, led to a proposal which was almost a mirror image of the 3/5 compromise. Now, Americans will get that. I mean, Americans understand that the 3/5 rule was, it took a long time to get rid of that. And some people in America feel that we never really got over it. But essentially, EU-backed proposal was that the Bosniak majority parts of the country, the people who live in them should be worth about 3/5 of a person who lives in a HDZ-dominated part of the country. That was their last proposal. That was the last thing they tabled, really. And ever since then, EU has done everything it can to disenfranchise the demographic and the democratic majority in Bosnia. I share Ambassador Gelbard's sentiments, and I think he comes from a very intellectually honest place. He's right. A lot of what's happening in Bosnia is a direct result of the decisions of the local elites. But imagine America, in which the most racist parts of the country, elements of American society, had a veto mechanism over decisions of the demographic majority, which had a sizable Black population within it. That's what we are. It's near impossible. I mean, I would bet anything I have that you are never going to get Milorad Dodik to agree to anything constructive. It will never happen. It is an impossibility. There's no political incentive for him to do so, number one. Number two, he does not believe in what we can propose, because deep down inside, he believes in the greater Serbia dream. So does Vučić. And this is the driving cultural framework that we've lived in the last 15 years, because the EU has allowed the genie back out of the bottle. Vučić, essentially, in my view, is playing a waiting game with the West. I think they were betting on a second Trump term in which they would create new facts on the ground, not in Kosovo, because I think Kosovo is not the main theater of this game. The main theater of this game is Bosnia, because Bosnia does not have a Western deterrence on its territory. EU4, as Kurt can, I'm sure, go into detail, is a joke. EU4 is not a credible deterrence in Bosnia. EU4 would not be able to even defend their own lot houses in cases of any sort of instability, let alone anything else. And they were basically waiting for the right moment to try to seize this part of the territory. I think that what the Americans often don't, well, Americans have changed culturally as well in the last 10, 15 years. I think people are more aware of forces of history in many ways, Americans as a nation. Even greatest Serbia never crossed the Drina River really meaningfully. So Dusan Serbia never had parts of Bosnia in it. Dodik is after the holy grail of greater Serbia nationalism, which is integrating parts of Bosnia into Serbia. That's what this is about. Now, EU doesn't care about that. EU wants to kick the can down the road and wants to pretend this is not happening, does not want to sanction Dodik, has rewarded Vučić with everything he wanted. So Vučić got exactly what he wanted every single time. Tadić before him got everything he wanted. Dodik is, in my view, the most desirable partner in Brussels right now. You have parts of CDU that are on the record saying that Dodik should be cut some slack. That's the sentiment among some people in CDU, and I think CDU here is the key interlocutor. But however, there's a new chance now, and I think this new chance will provide the opportunity for right kind of American engagement together with the Brits to create the incentives for the locals, as for the Bosnians, as Ambassador Gelbard said, to take charge. People can make choices, but creating incentives without some sort of reimposition of the rules will not work. I repeat, people get tired, frustrated. Bosnia will continue being a graveyard of many ambitious Western diplomats and politicians. There has to be an element of reimposition of the rules.
Thank you. And Kurt, I want to ask you about you mentioned a new social compact. I mean, one of the things that I come away with in all my years of being in Bosnia with many friends, studying it, talking to people, there's a subtle rage against politicians. You know, the Bosnian politicians are paid the highest per capita in Europe. When you know that many people who've lost limbs or who were raped have not been able to get a stipend, a monthly stipend that was, guaranteed, all the social services that are not available, just day-to-day life can be so difficult. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts about how you see that social compact.
Well, thank you for that question, because I think that's really important on where we go. I think there's large agreement among all of us panelists about the need to do what we can to change the incentive structure for the people who are established players now, who have disincentives to do anything positive, and probably won't do anything positive even if you do change the incentive structure, but at least you've limited the damage that they can do. I think the best fate for Dodik would be to close the exits. You have troops in Brčko, so there goes independent RS, bye-bye, forget it. And oh, by the way, no more money. I mean, what people, part of that enforcement element, before I get to the new social contract and answer your question, is, and which I don't think is recognized outside Bosnia as much as it needs to be, a safe and secure environment, which we are legally responsible, not just the Europeans, though they're the ones on the ground, but NATO underwrites that through Berlin Plus. We're on deck if they need backup. And we could reinforce that. That mandate was just reaffirmed at the UN Security Council last week. That's the most proximate fear a lot of people have is being clobbered by their own security forces. I mean, that's what happened at the end of the Justice for David protests in Banja Luka. That scares the hell out of Dodik. Every protest effort, 2013, 2014, you see even the non-nationalist politicians, the first thing they reach for when they feel threatened is to try to ethnically divide people, even if that ethnic division is not visible in the actions that people are undertaking. So if you take that toy away, I think a lot more becomes possible. And that's why I said, I think at the popular level, Bosnia is a much less divided society than it appears from without, and then it appears due to the structures that's been bequeathed to Dayton as a result of the war. I differentiate that, for example, say from Macedonia or Kosovo. It took killing 100,000 people in Bosnia and Herzegovina to divide a society. It took a lot of energy. It's like cracking a hydrocarbon molecule. It didn't take that much to divide societies that were already divided linguistically and so forth. So Bosnia was an integrated society. And yes, it is much more divided than it once was. There's no question about that. I'm not trying to erase that. But I think it's the Dayton structure and the political culture it engendered acts as an amplifier for all the divisions that are there. And we can't really even determine the background level of nationalism, if you will, under these incentives. So, but Ambassador Gelbart's absolutely right in saying this isn't all on us. It isn't. We can create a conducive environment for citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina who want a different structured state that gives them dignity. And we haven't used that word yet, but I think that is the undercurrent that people feel is lacking. And it's not just young people who are leaving. There are people, I'm 50 now. There are people who are contemporaries of mine who have checked out because they don't want their teenage kids to have to live in this. So people are leaving if they can, and it's not just economic drivers. It's just the constant carpet bombing of being humiliated by a government that treats you, that demonstrates they don't have to care what you think. And we in the past 4 years have experienced that too. I call Trump our first Balkan president for a reason. He's a very familiar type. And I think that now, I hope, and this comes back to a point that you made, Tanya, which I think is really important. You differentiated morality and foreign policy. I hope, and I think there's a lot of evidence to point to, Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, is definitely one who's ran a values-driven campaign, and I think that's the way he views the world as well. And so there's a logic in these things should come together here, and a human dignity element is there. So in the social contract, I could show you how I think we get there. And there's something that Almir had said about what should be involved, and I'll add that in before I shut up. This is a follow-on to the chart that I showed you. This is effectively how you get there. This is how we can contribute our best value added and give an opportunity for pressure from below. Effectively, we have to make the political elites more afraid of their own people than they are of us. To sort of turn around the scenario that happened when we had the last round of Sejdic-Finci talks during the February 2014 protests, when corralling of these politicians in the EU building, which also happened to be the German embassy, which expected something like this and evacuated intelligently. That would have been the place for citizens to surround and say, because that's where the politicians were negotiating. Those guys would have been terrified. They were terrified of their own people because they know they're not loved. We can instill fear. We could stop shoveling patronage down at these guys and renting social peace for them. And we could basically hold them hostage to fear of their own citizens, which we have helped give them an escape route from. And this needs to be coordinated, bottom up, top down. Effectively, that's what happened in North Macedonia, which allowed the breakthrough that allowed this government to come in, and they've squandered a lot of that moral capital subsequently. Now, ingredients, and I'd like to hear others on this, but I mean, the points that Almir Shishkanovic had said people want, the absurdity of having to do backflips and not being able to get healthcare, depending on where you are in the country, is crazy. Same thing goes with education. Education we treated as low politics for most of the Dayton period, but the politicians never did because they knew it was all about indoctrination and generating the next generation of voters. So we've been retro-engineering the state level and the local level, or we were retro-engineering the state level and local level back when we were trying to do some engineering, because all the power in Dayton is vested in those middle layers. The entity, and as a result of the Washington Agreement, which was supposed to apply to the whole state when it was signed, but subsequent, the contact group came up with a 5149, the cantonization of the federation. So I think those ingredients, this is something that the Constitutional Convention, and there are models for this. The Irish have done it on referendums. The Canadians have ways to include citizens and not just politicians. It cannot just be bringing around politicians around the table to say what you want to agree with, because anything that they can agree to, if they can agree, where they meet is a bad place. Nothing that's in their interest is in the popular interest by definition. So I'll shut up now, but thank you.
I want to go to Almir, and then we'll open it up from the audience. We have a few questions. I just want to say that it's very obvious and evident since 2012, there has been episodic social unrest. And it's, the baby crisis, when the baby couldn't get a national ID number and couldn't get health care, and the baby died. And there was absolute rage about it. I mean, they encircled the parliament for days. And then, of course, I think the climax of all this rage that's been building since 2014 around the country, 22 municipalities, was the David situation in Banja Luka, where you had people in the Federation, in solidarity with people in the IRS about the fact that the police were just simply not accountable. And so it's there in the population, this anger that you talk about, Kurt. It's there. It's unfortunate that the international community didn't help during those really important uprisings. And Almir, speaking of which, what has your reporting told you about what we've been talking about in terms of politicians and accountability?
It's very tough to make some reaction from the people. Why? Because you know that we have divided society, we have divided public opinion. So when we speak about Bosnia and Herzegovina, when we speak about the media, we have to know that Oslobođenje media group is maybe only one media group which take care about people from the all part of this country, without ethnic and the other dividing. So, but Oslobođenje, it's only one. When we speak about reaction of the people from Banja Luka, for example, on some story which is important from the people from Sarajevo, which is national important, we have problems to make that reaction, to catch that reaction, because people don't care about it. When we compare what the people in Banja Luka is reading, it's mostly newspaper from the Serbia, from Belgrade. So we have something which is worse than 1996, 1998. So I believe 25 years from the Dayton Peace Agreement, we have something which is society which is divided than 1996, 1997, when we speak about the interest of that society. So it's very tough for the media, especially for the reporters, which make story from other part of the Bosnia, other entity for media, which is based on the for example, from Banja Luka to Sarajevo and so on. So I believe that's something which is one of the biggest problems in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that is divided society and the public opinion.
Thank you. I was just going to say that, you know, the media landscape, and we did so much work, and there was, you know, press affiliation set up, press organizations, oversight. I mean, there was so much done. Yes, Oslobođenje still stands as truly independent, but this media landscape is a problem throughout the region, and it's a real problem that there's just not enough independent media. So it sort of retrenched itself in the region back to ethnic identified press. It's pretty pervasive. I just want to, we have a few questions and I want to bring them up for our panelists. Ryan Sherba from Balkan Blast is, he's asking, based upon this shift of the Trump administration to focus on Kosovo-Serbia dialogue has put BIH on the back burner per even with Special Representative Matt Palmer. In addition, the EU appears consumed with the Bulgaria and North Macedonia identity dispute. That's something we've been reading about recently. What are some specific opportunities for the Biden administration to refocus the US and EU on BIH? You want to take that, Ralph? Is Ralph here? Where is he? There he is.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so before I take Ryan's question, I just want to quickly rebut what Kurt is saying. I disagree with his take on this, and I have for some time. It could be that my background is, you know, partially politics, but I think that the protests in 2014 did not hurt the SDA. The protests were mostly based in Sarajevo. I think the violence and the looting that ensued actually helped the SDA at the polls, and they've, I think, won the highest percentage of the vote, and by far the most votes since, I think, 98. So that was their highest in 16 years, right? I think that relying on popular unrest is a recipe to have something that is not going to end well. That's just my view. I think that we have to absolutely must work with the people who are elected as they are, work with people in the parliament, absolutely include the civil society, but I will echo what a lot of the centrist Democrats have said after this election in the US, which I think applies to Bosnia as well. A lot of the let's defund the police, let's use some radical methods, I think has helped Trump. And I think relying on people going to the streets, including the David, I know people who did the protest for David, they're absolutely honorable people, they're nice people, good people, I agree with them mostly. But their protests, in my view, have unwittingly helped Dodik. Dodik has absolutely swept the 2018 election. It did not, most people thought that the protests would lead to the opposition increasing their share of the vote. It did not happen. So civil society, yes, civic leaders, yes, but we must be aware that despite all the flaws of the election procedure in Bosnia, the people who govern the country do have a popular mandate. It's a fact. It's an awful fact, ugly fact. I disagree with it. I wish it were different people, but I don't think we can approach this the way that, for example, Serbian opposition would like to approach Vučić, who I think does have an overwhelming advantage in terms of media and so on and so forth, right? I don't think elections in Serbia are entirely fair. Elections in Bosnia, not so much. There's still media freedoms. There's people like Oslobođenje Majgudalmir Šćekanović, Vildana. You're able to get to the people if you want to say something. It's just a fact. There's no denying that, right? So that's my point of disagreement with Kurt. I was personally involved in the 2008 protests that most people forgot. They were actually very consequential because they led to changing government in Sarajevo. You remember after the murder of the young teenager. But in general, I think we have to work within the system and with the people that are elected, right? And when it comes to Ryan's question, it's an excellent question. It's a very good question. It's very hard to speculate, really. I don't have a sort of a magic wand to say what exactly we're going to see down the road. But I think he posed two questions in the chat, so I'm going to try to tackle both of them. He asked whether a civic state should be a result of a revised Dayton, and what would stop the nationalists like Čović and Dodik from teaming up to disenfranchise the Bosniaks. I think that his two questions are connected logically, right? So the US disengaging from the Balkans has led to Dodik and Čović doing what they're doing right now. There's a direct correlation between US's disinterest and what's going on right now. So the mere fact that Biden is going to get involved in this at whichever level, I think that Biden has so many people that know the region very well, and there are many Americans who will do an excellent job at this. I think that if OHR is strengthened, and I don't know if Kurt shares my view still, but I think that Inzko gets a lot of negative publicity without a reason. I think that he's an honorable man, and I'm in minority there. I understand his position. It's very, very difficult to be Inzko. I think under the circumstances, I think he's done a very good job. Whether people want to change him or not is the other question. But I think Inzko in 10 years' time will be viewed as an honorable person. I think he did a good job in a very difficult environment. So strengthening the OHR will certainly lead to people like Dodik and Čović taking whatever the initiative is more seriously. They're going to take that, and this is where I differ from Kurt as well. They will take that much more seriously than any protest, because protests in 2014 were not even dangerous for Čović. I mean, he did extremely well after the protest, because they can always play the ethnic card, say, these people coming from across to try to take us down and so on and so forth. So I would be much more inclined to believe that concerted international effort at reimposing the rules will have a relaxing effect on the electorate. People would start maybe taking into account other options, and maybe would come out and vote in larger numbers if it's certain that there will be no war, there'll be no greater Serbia, and then that the physical security aspect is absolute.
I want to get to these questions. So we'll just get to the next one. It's from Aida Kama, and she says there are some plans to build a mini Schengen in Western Balkans. How realistic are such plans when we know they have been unable to settle the disputes over the borders between Serbia and Bosnia and Serbia and Kosovo? Northern Macedonia is continually having conflicts with Bulgaria. How realistic is this to build this mini Schengen? Kurt, do you want to say something about this?
I think Ambassador Gelbart.
Okay, Ambassador.
I'll just say one thing very quickly, which is I think I would equate this to this is a sort of kids table. This is PFP versus NATO membership. I think it's a way that you end up with a halfway house toward getting a common market within the EU. I think it's a wheeze that demonstrates a lack of strategic progress and leadership on the part of the West, including us, toward the region. So that's how I would attribute it. I don't put much stock in it.
Ambassador Gelbart?
What I wanted to do was go back to the previous question,
Oh, go ahead.
if you let me. First, I want to say something about Ryan. I read his publication every morning, and I think it's terrific. So thank you, Ryan. Second, I think Matt Palmer has worked really, really hard and below the radar, but as effectively as he could have under the circumstances, and really trying to achieve a great deal in Bosnia-Herzegovina and also in other parts of the region. It's not been easy. I think that the Biden administration, an incoming Biden administration, again, needs to work with the Europeans, as I said at the beginning, this is to buttress what Rauf said, and strengthen the hand of the High Representative. The High Representative, I think Insko could do a much better job if he were given the powers that he needs to get it done. He doesn't have the authority right now, because the authority a High Representative has is only as good as he or she receives from the EU in particular, but also from the United States. So those bond powers and strong signs of political support need to be given to the High Representative. And just to add to, I think it was Ryan's last question on the Bulgaria, North Macedonia thing. I mean, I would say on Bulgaria, I mean, this is outrageous. It's really ridiculous. The Borisov government is utterly corrupt, has no credibility at all, is probably doing this to try to distract popular attention from the demonstrations that have been going on every day for months. Mm-hmm. I know Bulgaria really well. This is a joke, and it's a bad joke. And the international community needs to put serious pressure on Borisov, on Dogan, and other people in Bulgaria to get this problem resolved immediately.
Well, that's pretty clear cut. One of my former students, Alexandra Lee Carpy, is asking a question, and Kurt, you want to take this. How do we read progress on the Mostar elections? Could the EU's role in this case be a model for international engagement going forward?
God, I hope not. and here's why. I think in very much the same way that Rauf explained regarding Sejdić-Finci, the operating assumption, there's a lust for deliverables. There's the idea we need some signifier for progress, rather. This is so successful, I'm putting air quotes there, that Dragan Čović wants to scale it to the whole country. And we're so desperate that we could have something that we could say we got done. And I think it does come down, I hate to be cynical, but I think it comes down to performance reviews for diplomats, but also just signifiers of progress, because the fact that they're not credible to the citizens doesn't really matter. It matters how, their chain of command. I think this has been a counterproductive thing. because it digs the hole deeper and dividing the city further and basically making it even a stronger duopoly between the SDA and HTZ, which is what it was before. So, so if the idea is that we get tighter feudalism statewide within the federation anyway, and we'll call that success, then that would be your model. I fear, though, and I think Ms. Carpy is right, that is the glide path. That is the direction of travel, and if it is continued, I think it's a mistake.
Okay, we have a question from Susan Kozinski Fritz, and I'd like to hear your views on this, Ambassador Gelbart and Ralph. Do you see any of the current candidates being discussed for Secretary of State as being more concerned about the Balkans? For example, Susan Rice is being discussed as possible secretary, although she's not shown much interest in Russia, Eurasia, or the Balkans when she was in the Obama administration. You first, Ambassador Gelbart.
Well, I think it's pointless to discuss possible candidates for Secretary of State or other positions at this point, except for White House Chief of Staff, since he's been named. I think what's more important, as we have been discussing it, is the question of the president-elect's orientation. And we know what that is, and it's a positive one. If he shows, and when he shows serious interest in a subject, then the rest of the government will follow on, particularly on this kind of subject.
Sorry, you have anything to add, Ralph?
Yes, I absolutely agree with Ambassador Gelbart. I think he's exactly right. One thing I'd add is that my instinct is that Bosnia portfolio and the Balkans portfolio will this time around be run directly out of the White House. I think that state will, of course, be involved, but there's too much noise for this not to be on the agenda at the NSC in a serious manner. So I think that Secretary of State will be dealing with other more sort of pressing issues that require sort of whole of government effort. And Bosnia is not one of them. I mean, Bosnia, as some of us have been saying for many years, is compared to other problems in the world, really, is a medium to low hanging fruit for the US. I mean, if US really gets involved, the ball will be moved down the field. That's just physics. So my bet is that it'll be mostly run out of the White House.
Okay, we have another question. Thank you. We have another question from an anonymous source. Will the Biden administration succeed in repudiating the human rights violations and disenfranchisements entrenched by Dayton? That's a big question. Kurt, you want to take a swag at?
I could take a swipe at that. I mean, I think but it's sort of baked into what Ambassador Gelbart said in terms of the disposition of the administration and recognizing what the problem is. I'll take just a second to say I've never advocated civic violence or civil unrest. I've advocated civil disobedience. And in a controlled environment, which is what I've always advocated coming first, maintaining a safe and secure environment, I think you create an atmosphere in which that's a lot more likely. So I just wanted to clarify that because I don't think that might have come out as clear. There had been a point though that was made earlier about a civic state, and I think that sort of joins up nicely.
Yes, actually, speaking of that, just don't mean to interrupt you, Kurt. Ryan's asking about a civic state and how could that stop, nationalists from teaming up together against Bosniaks?
Well, I think it's not just nationalists teaming up against Bosniaks. I want to be clear. That happens too. And there's no doubt that the Dodik-Jovic alliance has become ever more clear. But they also have common interests with, I mean, SDA is teaming up with Jovic on Mostar. They always can find a modus vivendi. It's a question of what the terms are. And the point that I want to underscore here is that yes, a civic state let's dissect this, because I think that the ethnic versus civic quite often becomes a sterile debate. It doesn't mean that you're not a good citizen if you feel yourself to be Bosniak, Serb, Croat, Herzegovinian, whatever. And people do need to feel like they have some sort of protections against anybody who might want to persecute them, but it is so baked into the structure, and it's a lease for, it's a license to be a crook, because essentially the political elites as it stands now says, we know you don't like us. We know that you know that we're thieves and you hate us when we drive by in black Audis, but hey, we'll protect you from those guys. And where else are you going to go? And we've got any political structure that follows has to aim at that. So I don't think we should be trying to navigate from how do we make this better. We have to navigate what kind of state do Bosnians and Herzegovinians of all self-descriptions, how can they agree on getting a critical mass of each self-defined group to agree to that? And then you have to retro-engineer to where we are. And that has to involve citizens, and it can't just be established civil society groups, a lot of whom are effectively captured too, because they don't want to alienate their donors. So I do think a much more civic state where your rights are not primarily whether you're BC or S definitely has to be the end result. And that disempowers everybody with a vested interest in this current system. Yes, Dodik and Čović, also Izetbegović.
Thanks. I want everybody.
Can I add something? Just
yes, you can. And
I mean, I wasn't implying, Kurt, that you were absolutely, advocating for violence. I mean, that was not my intention. I'm sorry if it came out wrong. However, we disagree on Mostar. I think Mostar is widely misread. The rules that Čović accepted in Mostar is exactly what he spent the last 12 years saying he wasn't going to accept. Now, we'll see what the outcome is come election day. But the HDZ really did not get what they wanted. So there's a very realistic scenario under which Čović loses what he already has. And he already has control of Mostar. If the election outcomes mirror the 2018 election outcomes in Mostar, it's very likely that HDZ will lose the position of mayor of Mostar, which will be a huge blow to Čović. What Čović got in exchange for the Mostar deal was a general vague verbal concession from the rest of the participants that he will get, that the election law will be tackled next. And that's something that he's been getting for the last 7-8 years, basically since the Fule thing, right? And I think that I agree that the SDA has been in coalition with the HDZ for a very number of years, but there's a new dynamic at play, which is fairly recent. And that's the HDZ essentially is for the first time ever seriously attacking the SDA politically at every level, because of which there's no federation government. People don't even talk about it. The federation government has not been, so it's been over 2 years since the election and there's no federation government. So basically HDZ has been ruling because they have the majority within the federation government. They're refusing to allow the SDA to take over the federation government. So the results from the 2018 election have not been implemented because Čović does not want to allow that to happen unless SDA gives him the election law. So I think the dynamics are a bit different than, let's say, a year ago, certainly very different than they were 5 years ago when the SDA kicked me out personally from federation government because I wasn't willing I wasn't willing to play along with Čović. So I think that it's a bit more complex right now than it was even 6 months ago.
Okay, well, we're almost at the end of this really, really great program discussion. I want to give everybody 1 minute for last comments. What's your takeaway of this situation? Like, what do you think going forward can be done, or what is your last comments? And I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Gelbard.
First, again, thank you very much for putting all this together. I think it's been very interesting. I've been extremely interested in the views of the other panelists and good questions. This is not easy to get moving. 25 years of semi-stagnation, but peace is hard to undo. Getting international cooperation generated is not easy, but can be done. Getting the Bosnian population to work constructively and cooperatively is not easy, but can be done. It's a question of political will and thinking about common future. I think if I had to choose one thing that I think could help generate some forward progress, it would be, and this is a series of things culminating in one, return of the bond powers to the High Representative and removal of Milorad Dodik. He needs to go. And I think that would be the kind of spark that could help generate progress on the part of everybody, because it would be a shock to the system. But then there needs to be the kind of pressure on both Croatia and Serbia and heightened political will on the part of the EU and the United States and Russia to make all this happen.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gelbart. Elmir, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts as a journalist about the Dayton Peace Accords, and what does Bosnia need in your view?
I believe we need political talks again, not how to search, how to resolve problem of Croats or Dragan Čović. We need political talks about Sejdić and Finci, because that is human rights problem. So that's my opinion, and I hope so. We will find some solution for that Sejdić-Finci problem in the next years. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd like, Kurt, I'd like to hear your last thoughts.
Thank you. I mean, I think that I'm hopeful, which is not to say Pollyannish, but I think this is a window of opportunity to arrest the regression. It's not just stagnation. We've been going backwards for a while, and it's evident on the ground. But this is an opportunity. A lot of things have to be wired together, but I think there's the will on the part of the incoming administration to have this be of a piece of reconstructing transatlanticism. I mean, this is a place where we have more power in the domestic environment than anywhere else on Earth. It's not a mandate problem. Yes, I agree on reinvigorating the bond powers and reinvigorating the military deterrent. With Dodik, I think the best thing to do would be to politically castrate him by taking his biggest talking points away, and then let fate have its way with him. But that's a relatively minor detail. The fundamental point is, who are our partners in Bosnia-Herzegovina? And I'd say our primary partners, they're going to be a force multiplier, have to be at the popular level, and that's going to empower us in dealing with the politicians. If we do not do that, and we deal with our politicians, the primary interlocutors, we're going to get reheated crap again.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Ralph?
It's been a terrific panel, honestly. My final minute.
Thanks for all your help too, Ralph.
Yes, absolutely. So my final minute, I'll spend on two things. Number one is that US has to hit the ground running. So Biden admin has to be ready on day one. We should not be spending time on trying to figure out who in Europe is willing to go along with us. That is absolutely clear. It's the Brits, and more likely than not, Berlin. Berlin will follow Washington and London in whatever it is that we want to do, as long as it's not, using violence, which is nobody's proposing, right? Every minute spent trying to convince the French, especially Macron, to join in will be a minute lost. Will be a minute that will be losing political momentum to do something on the ground. Macron is very firmly in Team Putin when it comes to the Balkans. I think that's absolutely, I don't think we should even argue about that anymore. This is where I see a danger. I see a danger in Biden team trying to reinvigorate Atlanticism at the expense of acting in the Balkans. Because if we agree that the Europeans should lead, nothing will happen. Americans have to lead from the front. That's the most important takeaway from the last 15 years. U.S. has to lead. We can't let the Europeans, lead us astray. And my second point is that once the incentives have changed, and I love Ambassador Gelbart's proposal. I think it's an excellent one. I think OHR plus removal of somebody, right from the beginning. Once the incentives have changed, we will see a completely different political dynamic. We'll see a dynamic that will probably not be the same as the dynamic 15, 20 years ago, but you will see opposition in the IRS hedge their bets. They will no longer be willing to go along with Dodik when it comes to the Greater Serbia dream. If it becomes apparent that after, ideally, a British company or 2 or 3 are deployed to Brčko, if it becomes apparent to everybody that IRS independence is not possible, things in the IRS politically change absolutely dramatically. And this is a window of opportunity for a deal which can include civic groups and citizens and so on. But people who've been in politics know that absolute transparency is sometimes dangerous to the pork, to the sausage making. Sausage making is a very delicate process that sometimes involves people being able to say things behind closed doors that they cannot say publicly because they want to survive politically. This is very important. I know that a lot of people, including my friend Kurt, don't agree with this, but I would be very, very cautious in trying to sort of change the political elite along with changing the system of governance.
Thank you, Ralph. I'm going to just say, I wrote a memo to Secretary Clinton in 2016, that National Security Council recommendation on day one, what should you do? I could pull that out today and use the same memo. But if I were to be able to, I agree with everybody here, particularly like Ambassador Gelbart's approach. It reminds me of how you always have been, Bob, and I really appreciate it. Very straightforward. Bring it. So all I can say is that if I was sitting across from Joe Biden, I would say, for all the realpolitik, for Atlantic American presence back in Europe, a force for good, the people of Bosnia deserve this opportunity as well. And they have been telling us that over and over since 2012. And I just will leave it there. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Thanks for stepping in, Almir, and we really appreciate you stepping in, and we thank our audience for their questions. And have a great day, and we'll see what happens very soon on January 20th.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.